Much like the ideas of Augustine, Aquinas follows suit, and I want to spend some time discussing him. But before we do that, I'd like to take just a moment off to the side, and if I could maybe quote entertain you for a few moments before we get into the deaths of Aquinas, which I think is very interesting in and of itself. Um, I think I've shared with you that I'm working on the new edition of Michael Wertheimer's History of Psychology, and I've been doing it for a number of years, about 3 or 4 years. I might add, not successfully because of APA, but I've resumed the activities this semester. And one of the things that's important to me as I bring in my thinking into the new edition, because Dr. Wertheimer himself is quite old. Yeah, he's 92, 91. He's basically told me that I'm primarily responsible for the upcoming edition and any further editions after this one, and that is because he thinks I might be in a good place to carry the torch further. A quick side comment as I go forward on this one. Um, One of them is that Michael Wertheimer's father is the father of Gestalt psychology, which we'll talk about later on this semester. He's professor of psychology at the University of Colorado. But one of the things that has brought me to that point of trying to write is that I believe that you should always have the original references. In other words, if you're in doubt, don't rely on people's writing about other people's writings, but try and write the material as if you actually read it yourself. So I've been collecting books, psychology and philosophy books, for some time. If we get a chance to go to my practice, I have 3 bookshelves of old books. One that's not there, actually, it's in my home. It's probably my most interesting book is um, what I think is hands down the most important book that I own in my collection is from St. Thomas Aquinas, and I'll talk to you about that in our discussions today. The book that I have is from 1546, so it's quite old. But let's talk about Saint Thomas Aquinas. And the reason I say Saint Thomas, because he, like many of the others, is considered a saint by the Catholic Church, which means that his ideas have been considered so important that has a special place in the history of psychology. So he was born probably in 1226 in southwestern Italy, I guess what you and I might call Naples. By most standards, he comes from a well-to-do family, and and he actually was born in a castle. There were 9 children, and most of them were boys, but not all. And because of the fact that he was smart, and very often it was the case of well-to-do families that smart children would go into the priesthood. In fact, there were 2 professions that were considered to be really important during many years, especially in the years where Aquinas was born, and that is either you went to the military or you went into the priesthood. And he was chosen to go in the priesthood. So he went as early as the age of 5. In other words, when he was able to read, he went to live in a Benedictine abbey, a monastery that was actually founded by Saint Benedictine. So clearly he was influenced greatly by that. Uh, in some ways, that possibility, if you will, that being in a position to live there gave him the chance to not only get access to information, but get some significant power. He studied what you and I would call the liberal arts. Those arts included, but were not limited to, grammar, logic, rhetoric, or if you will, debate. And then he was exposed to math, geometry, which of course was really founded by Descartes. We'll discuss him later on semester, and even astronomy and philosophy. These were all very critical. Some of this information he actually had the opportunity to read in the writings of Aristotle, which somehow the other had been I'm not sure if discovered or just not well discussed until about that time. And it was then that he became involved in what you might call thinking about thinking. He went on to pursue university education in Naples, and then was involved with the Order of Preachers. It's what you and I would call a religious sect of the Catholic Church, and the person who founded that was a priest by the name of Dominicus. He was given the opportunity to be exposed to a life of the flesh, and he chose not to do so. And in fact, he was given the opportunity to be with several women, and he chose instead to pursue becoming a priest. He was sent to study at the University of Paris, maybe around 45 or so a few 20s or so, and then he spent some additional time at the University of Cologne in Germany. These were all brand new universities. Most universities are about 500 years old. So these are some of the early universities, which, by the way, universities at the time were always an extension of the Catholic Church. Usually what happened is the churches would build a cathedral, and then right next to the cathedral was a very small church-looking building. In fact, the inside looked exactly like it. Had a pulpit and pews and so forth, so on. And the students would sit in the pews, and the priest or friars would lecture from the pulpit. Having been to one of these many years ago, University of Salamanca, I think maybe the oldest university in Europe, I was shocked to see that this tiny, quote, church-like was actually a university. In fact, I thought it was an old church that had been converted into a school, as sometimes happens in the States, but in reality, that was not the case. He was very much dedicated to both being a priest, but also to being academic. He ended up at the University of Paris, and then eventually migrated back to Italy, where he spent time in both Naples and Rome before going back to Paris, and then finally back to Italy and specifically to Naples, where he spent most of the rest of his life. So here we have an individual that was considered by his family, which is a successful family, to be important, and as a consequence be given the opportunity for higher education, and that higher education occurred in various locations, but always associated with a Catholic influence. He had all kinds of interesting ideas, and surprisingly began to write about the Bible. He read St. Paul's letters, and then wrote in the New Testament, and then provided a commentary on that. He also wrote something on Aristotle, and then subsequently began to get into writing the foundations of what today is probably considered the foundation of Christianity and certainly Catholicism, and it's all written, and it provides a foundation also for Western thought. The book is called Summa Theologica, and the book that I have is it's handwritten and beautiful graphics. Has a calfskin on the outside, and I should bring a picture of it, or maybe if I can't, even the book itself. But it's about that thick, big wide book, and the parchment is just unbelievable. In this book, he begins to outline the foundation of how to live. He takes the idea of St. Augustine, and specifically of free will, and begins to ask the question: why is it that you should live a good life? And of course, the outcome is heaven. But more importantly, how is it that that life is accomplished? And the many articles that are part of this magnus opus, which is really an unbelievably long long list of things. He talks about how is it that you should try and begin to focus on thinking as a way to resolve the problem. I don't know if you remember a few minutes ago I explained to you the idea that he rejected the life of the flesh. And he began by saying that we have the option to engage in these animalistic thoughts or behaviors for that matter, and alternatively you could end up maybe trying to avoid them by surpassing them. And maybe this surpassing them is influenced by his own reading of Aristotle, including the anima, which we'll talk about later on, and specifically was that you could conquer using the free will we talked about already, these bad influences, and you use it based on two or three things. One of them is the idea of faith. In other words, you have faith that if you do the right thing, you'll end up in the kingdom of God, and also reason, and that is the mechanism that you use to make the correct decisions. If you make the correct decisions, then you can get to live the life of God. Now, think about it from the standpoint of death penalty. If you commit a murder, you can either go to heaven, which is essentially you're released from jail, or like for example, because of self-defense, or you could go to limbo, which essentially would be like life in prison, or you could go to hell, which essentially would be what happens if you get sentenced to die. You can only get sentenced to die if you have the capacity to engage in reason. In other words, a child cannot commit a crime of this magnitude and be sentenced to die because they don't have the capacity to reason. And he talks about that this occurs only after you've been educated. So in some ways, he brings the foundation of what you and I might call philosophical psychology, and where he goes into the metaphysics of thinking. And in many ways, this is the beginning of what you and I might call modern day science. Even though he doesn't talk about it, it's the idea that an analysis of thinking is the only way that one could begin to understand how is it that you can engage in correct thinking. But again, as I mentioned earlier, thinking is only possible at a complex level because you're an adult. And this is the foundation of modern day epistemology, where we start talking about the nature of knowledge. In other words, how does this all come to be? Knowledge only occurs as a function of the accumulation or the amalgamation of a series of reasoned decisions. In other words, if you engage in a great deal of decision making, then one could argue that if you put it down in a compendium, in many ways like the Summa Theologica, which is his most famous book, you then would begin to have an amalgamation of a way of thinking. That if you have a series of reasoned thought over time, that becomes a pattern, and that pattern then becomes the foundation of knowledge. There are four major ways to understand the decision, and one of them, or in other words, how you make decisions. One of them is what we call efficiency, that you engage in a decision because it's efficient, or you could make a decision or a cause that is simply because of related meanings, somewhat like we talked about in terms of St. Augustine. In other words, that things come together largely because one leads to another. There's formal, and that is, formal may be the nature of a thing. You can analyze the nature of something because it's an animal, or it's because it's living, and so forth, so on. Later thinking, and especially with empiricism, the foundation of modern day science, talks a little bit about this kind of cause. Then the final cause, it may be that in some ways that there's a purpose, if you will, I guess for lack of a better word, there's a purpose for things, more of a functionality. In other words, the reason for something occurs is because there's some outcome of all of this. Again, I think probably one thing that we could kind of glean from all this is the idea that Aquinas talks about free will as the foundation for making decisions, and then that we end up using reasoning if we have the capacity. In other words, if you're not infirmed or old and can't think, as in the case of dementia, or a child because they don't have the capacity to make moral decisions. If you get a little further down the road, then one could argue that you're in a position to make that. And then you do so by these different causes. Then as you put these causes together, then you can make a decision, and those decisions produce as a series or patterns, and those patterns has become the epistemology, the foundation of knowledge, the foundation of thinking, and that foundation becomes knowledge itself. So even though some of us are not Christian, and certainly not Catholics, the idea of St. Thomas Aquinas is very much fundamental to modern day thought. I think one could argue it's modern day philosophy, but also beyond just being modern day philosophy, it's the foundation of what you and I might call modern day science. It is certainly the foundation of empiricism, and empiricism, as we'll see later on, is the foundation of what we might call modern day science. Now, let me end on this concept that I think warrants some attention, and that is it possible? Is it possible that science itself is a belief system? Just the other day, I read an article on scientism. We don't think of science as a belief system, even though we think of religion and Christianity specifically as a belief system. In fact, in Europe and in Latin America, they don't ask you if you're a Christian. They ask you, are you a believer? Well, one could argue that I may or may not be a believer in Christianity, but as a psychologist, I am a believer in science. And then the question I want to raise with you today, even though you may not be a believer in Christianity, as a psychology student, hopefully you're a believer in science. And then the question that I propose to you as we begin to wrap up our discussions today in all of this, is science a belief system too? And if it is, can we question it? Because whether you're thinking about Augustine or you're thinking about Aquinas, you are thinking about the idea that this is a belief system that is not questionable. Well, in science, we believe in question, but maybe we don't believe in questioning. All right, that should do it for today. Thank you for listening, and look forward to seeing you soon. We have, by the way, another presentation of this type for Tuesday, because I will be attending a Board of Trustees meeting at the university. I just joined as a Board of Trustees. Unfortunately, they moved the meeting. It was a meeting that was not in conflict with class, but it turns out that it is. So you'll be seeing another of me before too long. So until then, take care and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.